so much. I love you so much. I love you so much. I love you so much.
Hello, all you positive heads out there. Thanks for tuning your beautiful brainwaves into another episode of the Positive Head Podcast, where we are firmly convinced that creating success and happiness is rooted in understanding the ultimate nature of reality and the fact that as human beings, we are all immensely powerful fractals of the one and only source consciousness, which creates and animates all things. Now, of course, understanding this powerful truth is one thing. Applying this incredibly empowering wisdom to everyday life? Well, that's another, which is exactly why we provide you with a fresh serving of soul food for thought 5 days a week to help constantly remind you of what matters most. You are it. And I'm your host, Brandon Beecham. I'm the reflection and extension of you who will be here each Wednesday interviewing a different consciousness changemaker. And on the other 4 weekdays, leading the way to ensure that your perspective is consistently expanded, your vibration is constantly elevated, and your heart is overflowing and full. Also, before we jump into today's episode, I'd like to take about a minute and a half to tell you about a few sponsors that not only help to make it possible to produce this show 5 days a week, but that I'm also genuinely passionate about promoting. The first longtime stellar supporter of the show that I want to mention is Gaia. If you're not familiar, Gaia is the go-to source for streaming consciousness content online with over 8,000 video titles. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. The second sponsor I'm sincerely passionate about promoting is Purium. It's no mystery that bringing your mind, body, and spirit into balance is necessary if a person truly intends to manifest the greatest and grandest version of themselves. So if you've been looking for a way to easily get organic superfoods into your system every day with a simple plan that can help you reestablish a healthier foundation and relationship with food, like I was doing before I found Purium, I highly recommend going to positivehead.com/transformation and checking out the videos and interviews there where I dive deeply into discussions explaining why I take these products every day. And should you ultimately end up on iShopPurium.com to purchase any of their 50 plus amazing superfood products, be sure to use the code POSITIVEHEAD, all one word, for a 25% discount. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Anthony Peake here with me on the show. Anthony is an avid explorer that has authored 8 books in his noble quest to perceive if consciousness indeed transcends time and space beyond the veil of physicality. And as you guys know, that's a subject that's near and dear to my own heart. So, Anthony, hello. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Absolutely great to be talking to you, Brandon. Really great.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's definitely, like I said, one that's near and dear to my heart. And yeah, you've been at this a while. So why don't we do this? Let's start at the beginning. I always like to get my very standard, not all the listeners know that they're very, very predictable how I open and close. And my opening question is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Understanding consciousness.
With 9 floors to go, and she'll be able to ponder that for a while.
And then I'll drive her crazy. Telling her all about it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. I'd love to hear a little bit of your backstory. How did you end up on this, epic trail of exploring consciousness for, many decades now?
Yeah, well, it's almost my life story, really, in that probably I've been interested in human extraordinary experiences ever since I was probably about 8 or 9 years of age. Indeed, one of the things that really stimulated my interest was that I came down with double pneumonia when I was, it's about 12, I think. And during that time, I had a series of quite strong hallucinations as part of the crisis of pneumonia. My mother, being a nurse, knew that the crisis of pneumonia was going to be taking place, so she was ready for it and everything. But I still found it absolutely amazing that I was seeing things that just weren't there. I knew they weren't there, and I knew they weren't real, but they were fascinating. And indeed, I'm a lifelong sufferer, is the wrong term, experiencer of classical migraine, which means that I get pre-migraine headache.
I like how you frame that.
Yeah, because I experience it. I don't suffer from it. I experience it. It's the same with other people I write about, like people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy and people who experience schizophrenia as well. And I think they're all related. But my migraine auras have always been of absolute fascination to me. And when they start, they're a pre-warning that I'm going to get a migraine headache. Actually, these days, I don't get the headache anymore. I just get the aura. But my visual system breaks down. I see patterns, all kinds of extraordinary things. So as I was growing up, I was very keen to continue studying this subject. And I was fortunate enough that my mother was very interested in books. So we had lots of books in the house. And I was able to read around the subject. And indeed, in the UK, in the late 1960s, there was a part work came out called Man, Myth and Magic, which was very much a very academic approach to extraordinary experiences. And that really set me up wanting to be academically interested in this subject, not along the gee whiz, these wonderful things happen to people, but actually understanding why these things happen to people. So when I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go to university in the early 1970s, I had the option of various places, and I chose in the end to go to Warwick University, because they did dual honor degrees. So you actually do 2 degrees in parallel. It was hard work, but it was worth doing, because the 2 degrees I did was sociology and history. So it gave me the opportunity to not only understand human history, but also a lot of the courses focused in on things like the sociology of religion, the sociology of language, the sociology of belief, and also the overlap subjects, because I was quite fascinated by what took place immediately after the Reformation in Europe, where there were all these incredibly strange religious groups that came up, the religious groups that came up after the English Civil War. Some of their belief systems were really quite intriguing to me. So I became interested in these kind of things, which then moved on after I graduated from university. While I was at university, I was involved in a small group where we used to pop around the Warwickshire countryside trying to discover ghost places, which was really quite exciting.
Fun.
And I also majored in art history as well. So I was quite fascinated by the depiction of art, how artists work and how artists function. So when I graduated, I was given the opportunity. I did postgraduate work at the London School of Economics in London. And then I started on a standard management career, really, in various businesses across the UK, in aviation and various other companies. But I was in the position in 1999 where I had the sufficient funding to take a year out to write a book. I just decided I needed to write a book. I didn't know what I was going to write about. I just did. And my wife was incredibly understanding, and she said, no, we can support you. You take a year out and just write your book, which is what I did. And literally a year later, a book came out. It was amazing. I just sat in front of a blank screen the first day, wondering what on earth I was going to write about. And I started having, and this is the interesting thing, in front of the blank screen, I started having an aura state, a migraine aura. And I had the most profound deja vu sensations. I felt that I'd sat in front of that screen trying to come up with ideas. And the idea became, what on earth is deja vu? When you have deja vu experiences, what are they? And from there on, the book spun off into near-death experiences, spun off into fascinating areas of neurology, into areas of brain structures, and into the idea of what actually happens to human consciousness at the point of death. And I was delighted at the end of it. I came up with a concept I called cheating the ferryman, which I then sent off to the International Association of Near-Death Studies. and they were quite intrigued. And Professor Bruce Grayson, who's professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia and was then the main man in the Institute of Near-Death Studies, decided he would help me publish an peer-reviewed academic paper on the subject of my hypothesis. And indeed, that was published in winter 2004. And on
you
the
jumped
back
right
of that,
in the deep end.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I started off from the academic side. And I remember one day when Bruce rang me because there was one particular reference we couldn't find anywhere. Because, of course, with an academic publication, you really have to make sure that your references are correct, you know. And he found it for me. He came back to me and he was really pleased. He said, we found the reference you needed, which was the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle. That was I was then in a fortunate position then because I'd been trying to get a publishing deal. I wouldn't self-publish because to me, I think, I have certain opinions about self-publishing. I wanted a proper publisher and I wanted a publisher to buy my work because if a publisher doesn't buy your work, there has to be a reason for it.
You're right.
And I was in the fortunate position that I sent the manuscript off to a publisher in London. And again, it's the way synchronicity works and the way chance just happens is that the chief executive and owner of the publishing company happened to be flying to New York for a meeting. And he was in his office and he wanted something to read. And he literally picked up my manuscript and read it on the plane. And he actually phoned back. And he phoned back to the UK when he arrived in New York after reading. He said, "We've got to publish this book." And the rest, as they say, is history. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, and now you've written, 8 books and co-authored some others. And so, for me, one of the great joys of doing this podcast is, getting the opportunity to, pick the brains of people like yourself who have spent so much time and energy distilling wisdom into their writings. And then, I get to sort of receive some of the cliff notes, if you will. And of course, the listeners, it's always great for the listeners too, because, especially the authors that they're really intrigued by. Now they have a whole new, path to traverse down and explore the works of that particular author. So I think what would be great with our time today is to really understand and learn what we can about what it is that you've sort of expressed and shared and learned, over the years with your writings. So I don't know exactly how you'd want to start that or where or what book, but I think that's always would be a good approach if you agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I always consider my work to be iterative in that my books develop. One book develops from another. In that I'm like everybody else. I'm a searcher after truth. I'm a searcher after facts. I'm a searcher after understanding of exactly what is taking place in the human condition. How
Truth
is it?
Seeker.
Absolutely. How is it that inanimate matter reacting with electricity in my brain can create me, create my hopes and my fears and my anticipations? I'm intrigued when people have extraordinary experiences, what is really taking place.
Me too.
And always trying to keep the science, using the science as the basis. What you'll find with my work is I will come up with certain conclusions and I'll pull facts together and say, look, if you look into this information, you pull it together, it seems to suggest this. But what I never do is say to my readers, yeah, I'm channeling this from the planet Tharg and it's the truth because the ascended masters have told me it's the truth.
Right.
What I do is I work under the statement that Marcelli Trui, the great skeptical Italian writer, once said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And this is what I do. I make extraordinary claims, but I also give the extraordinary proofs. Now, by extraordinary proofs, I mean that if you go to my books, every single reference I make will be reverted straight back to the back pages where it will give you the exact reference to an academic paper or a peer-reviewed paper or an article in a scientific magazine. So my readers can then say, well, if Anthony Peake is saying this, is it really true? And I say to them, go and read it yourself. If you come to different conclusions, that's fine. And this is how it's worked over the years because my initial books had a particular viewpoint about the near-death experience. And over the years, I've moved. I haven't changed the position, but the overall hypothesis has become more elegant as more and more science is out there that's proving my position. And it gets to the point now that, the evidence is almost overpowering as to what is taking place. It's just that it's in the areas of science that most people don't understand. Now, for instance, I'm fascinated by quantum mechanics and quantum physics, but unlike a lot of the writers in this field, I don't just use the buzzwords. I really make it my business to fully understand. If I use the term Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, I need to know I understand what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle means. Or in terms of quantum mechanics, I understand why it is so bizarre that these conclusions are come to. Because, of course, quantum physics and quantum mechanics are just completely counterintuitive in every sense or form. But what I don't do is then turn around and say, and because it's so weird, therefore I can explain weird things. That's not how it works. All this is telling us is that quantum mechanics is telling us there's something extremely odd about reality. And this oddness carries through from the very, very small to the supermassive, from quarks to black holes. And again, I will explain in detail, and in my books I always do this. So, for instance, if I discuss Schrodinger's cat in my books, which I do in a couple of the books, I explain in detail exactly what Schrodinger's cat is and why it is so odd and why Schrodinger came up with that idea and these kind of things. So
some people probably haven't heard that. I don't know if it would, maybe you want to give the quick explanation of what that,
quick
is
explanation.
About.
A précis of Schrodinger's cat. Okay, in very, very quick terms, in the 1920s, there were a group of scientists in Copenhagen called the Copenhagen Group, led by a guy called Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr and his associates, and they came up with a model of quantum mechanics. And effectively, in straightforward terms, what the Copenhagen interpretation effectively says is that until a subatomic particle is measured, it does not exist. Okay. It doesn't mean it's somewhere else. It does not exist. It exists in a wave, a statistical wave, that it may be in one location or the other. But the act of measurement or the act of observation collapses that wave function, as it's called, into a point particle. So, for instance, an electron. An electron is everywhere and nowhere until it's measured. Now, the
quantum
question
superposition, right?
In superposition. In fact, if that would be in two places at the same time, or when subatomic particles kind of mingle with each other and they become a single particle. But with the Schrodinger's argument, Schrodinger had problems with this because the implications were, in the final analysis, that if it is a measurement, who is doing the measuring? And what is being doing the measuring is a conscious observer measuring the fact that a subatomic particle exists or doesn't exist. Now, what he said was, this is utterly ridiculous. He said, imagine a scenario that you put a cat inside a sealed box for half an hour. And inside that sealed box is a sensor, which is attached to a hammer, which will then swing round and can break a phial full of poison, which will kill the cat if it's broken. And attached to that sensor, the sensor is there to sense whether a particular subatomic particle will decay or not. It's just a technical term, when it changes from one form to another or from one substance to another. Now, if you apply Copenhagen's interpretation to this and Niels Bohr and his associates, effectively, because that particle has not been observed, it is in a state of superposition. It is neither collapsed or not. It has decayed or it hasn't, which then means that the cat itself is in a superposition of states within the box. It is either alive or dead at the same time. And he said this is utter nonsense. But effectively, the science has proven because nobody's ever tortured a cat to do this, but scientifically, Schrodinger's cat was wrong. That is exactly what takes place. So the question then is, well, what is happening there? Does it mean that consciousness is directly involved? And the only alternative to this idea that consciousness collapses the wave function of all subatomic particles, and this is profoundly important because it means everything that physically is around you at the moment is made up of subatomic particles that are collapsed by effectively your act of observation or other people's acts of observation, but there seems to be a direct relationship with consciousness. The only alternative is something called a many worlds interpretation. And this was put forward by a guy called Hugh Everett III in his 1957 PhD thesis. And what Everett suggested was, is that the wave function doesn't collapse. The wave function continues, but what happens is one wave function continues to accommodate the fact the cat's alive, and another wave function accommodates the cat is dead. And what this effectively means is that the observer that opens the box becomes two observers, and the universe splits into identical copies of itself at that point. But not only that the universe has been doing this at every subatomic occasion since the beginning of for 13.7 billion years, or whatever the age of the universe is.
It's a lot of splits.
So there's an awful lot of universes out there. But if the universe is infinite, there is no reason why it couldn't accommodate a ridiculous amount of numbers of universes. But this is the extent that science will go to really be in denial of the fact that there is a direct relationship between conscious observation of a subatomic particle and the act of observation and consciousness. And this means that consciousness in some way is prime, and that physical reality is not what it seems. Physical reality and consciousness are at a lower level of reality the same thing.
Yeah, it's funny because this is, you're dating back to what you said, the 30s, right? And even as of, literally this morning on my social media feed, an article caught my eye, and it was referencing a recent article in Scientific American, a guy, Bernardo Kastrup, who, a scientist, philosopher.
I know Bernardo.
Okay. Yeah. And talking about, essentially this very thing still is now you of course hearing about it in Scientific American, and indicating basically his idea that all matter is an illusion, and only the mathematical apparatus they devise in their theories is truly real, not the perceived world the apparatus was created to describe in the first place, right?
Well, this is fascinating here because there is one of the world's top mathematical physicists is a guy called Max Tegmark, who is a particle physicist at Princeton, I think. And Max has come up with some fascinating books in the past, including something we could touch upon called the Quantum Suicide Experiment, which I cite in my first book. But also Max is very interested in this very issue of reality. And his book, he comes down to the mathematical structures. The only thing that really exists is, in effect, maths and information. Now, again, there's a guy called Vlatko Vedrel, who is a quantum physicist, was at the University of Singapore. And he, again, has the same arguments. But there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new that Bernardo is saying, and Bernardo himself would actually agree with this. You go back to people like Wigner and John Archibald Wheeler. A lot of these guys, this is the only conclusion you can come to. The issue is
ones and zeros.
Yeah, ones and zeros. But of course, the issue is the man in the street, the general public, are not aware of this because it is so crazy. I use the argument that what has happened is now our whole science has been created to accommodate the avoidance of the simple fact that reality is not solid, that there is, that reality at the moment is 99 point followed by 12 nines empty space. Right. And what is real within that empty space are actually just fluctuations in some form of field. There's nothing real. We are never in touch with anything. The only reason that I'm sitting on my seat now and not falling through the floor and flooring through the ceiling, through the roof through the floor of my house is because of electrostatic repulsion. You never touch anything. People say, "Oh,
that's wild." A lot of people don't get that, right? Everything it's all repelling, right?
Yeah, it is. It's just because it's just the way in which electrostatic forces work. It's just being repelled. So when there was a very famous statement that was made many years ago by an English philosopher when they were discussing the philosophy of Bishop Berkeley, and he turned round and he said, "I refute Berkeley thus," and he kicked a stone. How idiotic. And people cite that now as proof that the whole idea, that idealism, that in some way there's a relationship between the act of the observer and the external reality is nonsense. But they cite that, it is absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Right. Well, it's, I guess somewhat exciting is more and more people are coming around, it seems, to, this idea. You have people like Elon Musk, stepping forward and saying, hey, the chance that this is, a simulation is like, I don't know, or base level reality, I think as he referred to it, is like one in billions or something. And so it seems to be, and you've been at this a long time. So, I'm curious if you would agree from your perception that it's coming around and becoming more and more accepted that we are indeed in some sort of a, holographic simulation.
Totally. I mean, effectively, the whole thing really started, I think, in 1999, when an English philosopher whose name has just escaped me actually published a paper on the logical argument for us being in a simulation. And it's powerful. His argument is logical and it's powerful. And one of the major writers in this area, I mean, there's a lot of writers in this area, but in my own podcast last month, I interviewed a guy by the name of Jim Elvidge. And Jim Elvidge, his previous book, Universe Explained, and his latest book really puts it in probably far better than I could ever do in terms of explaining the logic behind the simulation. I try, but Jim is a better writer than I am in terms of getting the ideas across. And, this whole idea, it makes logical sense. It does make logical sense. And if it is a simulation, this could explain so much. And indeed, the whole simulation argument I've incorporated into my own cheating the ferryman hypothesis now to explain what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. And I know people will turn around and will be listening now and they'll be saying, geez, I mean, isn't this similar to lots of other ideas that are out there? I mean, there is a writer at the moment that's getting an awful lot of kudos called Lanza. Who's got a concept called biocentrism. And Lanza goes around stating his idea is absolutely unique. Nobody's ever come up with it. It's absolutely wonderful. And isn't he great? Except that his book came out 3 years after my book did. And my book does exactly the same as Lanza does with bells on. Lanza goes down one particular route. I link it to lots more things, but because I'm an obscure limey and I don't have all the gongs and PhDs that Lanza's got, he's getting all the kudos and all the credibility and everything else as well. But the proof is in the pudding. His book came out in 2009. Mine came out in 2006. Touche.
Wow. Yeah, I like that. So maybe you could give us a little insight into that book then. Okay. The idea behind it, the principle behind it, it's to do with when people have near-death experiences. There are a near-death experience is literally what it says. It's when somebody has been very close to death or has been technically, clinically nearly dead, who comes back and claims that they had experiences, claims that things happened to them when they were supposedly flatlined. And sort of like you guys, just to throw it out there, early on, we're near episode 900 or so with this, Anthony, and way back in the beginning, episode 81, I had Dr. Eben Alexander on.
Even great guy. Yeah. He was wonderfully helpful to me in one of my books because I had a section on his experiences and I sent what I'd written off to him to make sure it was correct. And he was wonderful. He really was good. Excellent, wonderful.
So
man.
You guys can go back and check that out. He was a Harvard, neurosurgeon who then, got meningitis and went into a coma and came back and essentially had, after a week in a coma, full account of all his time spent on the other side. So just throw that out there real quick.
Yeah, including seeing a sister he didn't know existed. So it was information he brought back that he had not been told by his family.
I forgot that point.
He met, as I recall, on the wings of he was imagining he was on the wings of a huge butterfly and a young woman approaches him. Incredible. That again is proof that if ever you needed it, because that's bringing back information that he did not know because she died apparently and his parents had just not told him.
Yeah.
Uncanny. That's veridical proof.
Sorry, but it brings to mind one of my regular sort of she'll come in co-host from time to time, Colby Rebel, who, psychic medium, and she actually had an experience like that here, where her dead father, who she never met, if I'm recalling, came to her and basically said, "Go search this name. This is your brother." She went. It was like a very common name. He then told her, "Yep, that's the one." Out of all the list of them, he contacted this person and said, "Hey, I know it's a little weird, but I think we might be related." Turns out she met her brother through her dead father. She never met in real life.
That's it. To me, that is evidence. Now, what will happen is the skeptics will throw out the law of large numbers, the laws of
or she's lying.
Or she's just lying. They fall back on these pathetic things. The kind of things that scientifically, in terms of a laboratory, you wouldn't be expected to go to that degree of proof. But they're expected to. But it's because of this extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs, which, I'm with them on that. But, how much denial do you need to go to say that people have precognitions, that people have out-of-the-body experiences? It's powerful evidence. And I have people who work with me that I work with who have had veridical out-of-the-body, precognitive out-of-the-body experiences where they've been out of their body and seen a future event as it happens, then brought it back into the past and informed people who have signed affidavits for this. There was a bombing in London in 1999. This guy saw it in an out-of-body experience 5 days before. And when he came back, he actually said specifically whereabouts in London the bomb would take place. And 5 days later, he was absolutely spot on. Now, you could say coincidence. Well, how much coincidence are we going to stretch here? It's not he said a plane's going to crash somewhere in the world. He said there will be a bomb in this street in Soho.
Yeah.
Right. Wow.
It's kind of like the Afterlife. I'm sure you're familiar with the Afterlife Experiments. I read that book many years ago. It took place right down the road here from where I live at UCI. And, basically applied, I forget the author, but applied rigorous, scientific study to determine if mediums were able to communicate and pull information from beyond the veil. And I think it's in statistical analysis, it was like 1 in billions that it would be chance, if I recall. It's been years. A decade since I read it.
I can't think. It was Stephen Schwartz, I think.
Right.
But effectively, I would argue that you could also argue that is evidence that there is a field of information that sensitives can actually attune into, which I'll come back to later if I get the opportunity. But going back to the cheating the ferryman hypothesis, the general standards that are applied to near-death experiences are something called the Moody traits or the Grayson scale. And these are a series of, I think, 7 or 8 experiences that people have when they have near-death experiences. And I became very intrigued by these because some of them I found quite fascinating. Like people will turn around and say that in a near-death experience, time slows down. You get this feeling that time just slows down almost to a stop. Now, we all know this happens because people experience it all the time when you're in accidents, when you're given bad news. Time just goes, and of course, I've written a whole book on it called The Labyrinth of Time about what time is or what time isn't. So, I've actually got the gong on that one and spent 380 pages writing a book. And at the end of it, I still had no idea what time was any more than when I'd started. And in that, and with that, I'm with St. Augustine, who said exactly the same thing. And he said, I understand time till I start to think about it. And when I start to think about it, I just completely have no idea. But anyway, so time slows down. But also there is this meeting of something called the being of light, where they sense that there is a presence that will speak to them or talk to them. There is also something called a panoramic life review. I saw my life flash before my eyes.
Yep.
Now, I started looking at these things and I thought, well, why do these happen during a near-death experience? So I started to look into the neurology. And I discovered at that time, and my money was on this, which is that the brain releases in times of stress a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate is known to slow down our sensation of time and can sometimes bring about, to a degree, altered states of consciousness, the feeling of being outside of your body, these kind of things. It's technically disassociation. If you're in a position where you don't want to be, you're a child being beaten up or something, you will want to be outside your body. And this is what the skeptics will say, it's disassociation. Well, if it's disassociation, how is it you see things that you can't see in the outer body state that you could not see from your body, if that is the case? So that's nonsense. There's clearly something more happening here. But I put this together, and after a period of time, and in the book, I put together all the evidence for this, all the background science of this. And what I suggest is, at the point of death, and this is my original hypothesis, and I'll then explain how my later work reinforces this, is that you literally fall out of time. So in the final split seconds of your life, your time changes completely. You go into like a dream state, where dreams can last for days, but they're only a few seconds. You go into this state, the Bardo state, technically, I suppose, from the Tibetan Buddhism concept. But while you're in this state, this timeless state, your past life memories are brought up from somewhere else. In the first book, I argue they're actually taken from your brain's memories of your life, because I argue, and to a certain extent, I still think it's true, that your brain remembers everything that you experience. It's just that it's locked away. You can't access everything, but you can during deep hypnotic states. You can in various ways. So there is evidence that we remember everything. Well, we know of everything, but we can't remember it. And my argument in the first book was, why does the brain do that? Why does the brain waste so much energy keeping all that information when we don't remember it? So I argue that this is what happens when you die. Now, when you have a near-death experience, the past life review is aborted. You can remember, people will turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes. I saw my whole life in a split second. My question is, why does that happen? And I argue that what really happens is, in a real death experience, when you actually die, what happens is you live your whole life again. Your whole life from the moment of your birth to the moment of your death. But this time, and this is where I start applying the modern ideas, initially, I thought it was to do with the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, that there will be a version of you somewhere in the macroverse that will follow every line of your life and every opportunity. Because you remember I said before about Schrodinger's cat and the universe splits. Yep. If the universe does that, it means that effectively somewhere in the multiverse, there are billions and billions of versions of you, all of whom will follow subtly different life courses. Some will be subtly different. Some will be hugely different. There'll be versions of you where your parents could have emigrated to every country in the world, and you would have grown up in that country and been a different person. Your parents might have met 10 years before, 10 years after. All those potentials are out there. Okay.
Right.
Now, but the issue with that is that I've got to go to the many worlds interpretation. But if we take and we go back to the idea that this is a simulation, then it gets clever, because there is something called a 0 point field and 0 point information, 0 point energy. And effectively, this is the old concept of the Akashic field, the Akashic record. Underlying this universe is an information field made up of digital information. And again, if you read the book, the latest work of people like Juan Maldacana and Jacob Bekenstein, the Israeli physicist who died recently, and Stephen Hawking, all these guys are saying that this simulation argument has legs. And that everything that can happen does happen somewhere within the simulation. So when you die, what happens is you start your life again as if you're in a virtual reality recreation of your life. Now, imagine, my generation, I remember playing Tomb Raider. Do you remember what happens to Tomb Raider? You switch on the screen and you have a little Lara Croft in front of you, and she's in a cave. And she runs down the cave, goes into her room, and a monster comes out and kills her. She's dead. She's disappeared. She's dead. However, you, the game player, are not dead. You know what happened. So what happens is a new Lara Croft is created when you play the game again. And this time, you make sure as the game player, she doesn't go into that room to get eaten by the monster. Right. Okay? Now, I argue that at the point of death, our consciousness splits. And it splits into two elements, what I call the Daemon and the Adeline. The Daemon is the you that remembers all your past lives. The Adeline is born and dies many, many times. And it doesn't remember its past lives, like the on-screen sprite doesn't, but the Daemon does. So when you're living your life now, I'll guarantee there'll be thousands of people out there listening to this who will go, how many times in my life have I had that feeling, woo, I've done this before, I've been here before, I've seen this before, this is deja vu. It's exactly what
future
it feels
memory,
like.
right?
Future memory, because there's part of you that remembers, but not only that, the part of you remembers the dangers. So how many times have people said, don't go there? Or they hear a voice in their head that says, don't catch that plane.
Yep.
Don't do this, don't do that. This is the daemon. And the daemon, depending upon how open your doors of perception are, is to how effective your daemon can communicate with you. I've had cases, and in my second book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I had hundreds of people from around the world who contacted me with their own experiences of this voice in the head, this thing that tells them not to do things. It's your game player. Now, what is intriguing here is, and it's statistically shown to be correct from research, Deja vus decrease as we get older. When we're young, there's a lot of them. As we get older, there's less of them. But they start again towards the end of your life. There's a perfectly good reason for this. Because the last time you lived your life, you might have only got to 10 or 11 years of age, and then 15 years of age, and then 20 years of age. So it's how far you get through your life. But there will be a point where the game will be new to you and your daemon. So you won't have any memories. So there will be no memories. The daemon can still try and guide you, but it's a terra incognita for that. Just as it is in a computer game when you get to the last kill point where you don't know what's going to be in the next room either. So your daemon doesn't know and the Eidolon doesn't know. Now, this is how it works. But the information I now have with the simulation argument is I can really pull this together and do the real science of this. And in my latest hard science book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I do the neurology of this to die for. You know, I do the neurology. I even say how this information is drawn up. I argue that it is to do with endogenous, that is internally generated dimethyltryptamine, which is synthesized in the pineal gland. I do the synthesis argument of how it's synthesized from melatonin into what we call metatonin. There's a guy called Beach Barrett who's been doing this research in the States. We know how the synthesis works. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but around about 4 years ago, there is an Japanese-American researcher called Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan. And she did a series of experiments, one on rats, and she discovered that after a rat is killed, around about 10 seconds afterwards, there's a huge amount of brain activity. It's the near-death experience. But the other interesting thing is that they found, for the first time, actual dimethyltryptamine in the brains of the pineal gland of live rats. This is the first time that it's been found in the mammalian brain. Now, what was it doing there? How did it get there? Now, we know it's in the blood. We know it's in the spinal fluid. But for this substance to be in the brain, and it would explain things, there are things in the brain called the sigma-1 receptors. The sigma-1 receptors are intriguing because they seem to be receptor sites in the brain that are designed to work with dimethyltryptamine. In fact, it's the only thing they seem to work with. There seems to be structures in the brain which actually suggests that dimethyltryptamine is a neurotransmitter. It is evolved. It is evolved with us. And Rick Strassman, who was the guy that did the research in the early 1990s at the University of Mexico.
Spirit molecule, right?
Pardon? The spirit molecule, correct. The
spirit molecule, yeah.
Yeah, and Rick, his research was very, very powerful, but Rick actually came out with the phrase and he said he believed that DMT is our reality modulator.
Right. It is like everything's a DMT trip, essentially, right?
Oh, totally. I work with people who are doing research on DMT at the moment. There's a major research campaign taking place at London University at the moment. And in fact, I'll be doing an event with some of these guys in a few weeks' time. And I was interviewing one of them recently about his experiences on DMT. And get this, he turned around to me and he said the first time he gets rockets out of his brain in DMT, and he's in what's called the Dmt Cage, the DMT zone. And he's in this place floating in space. And there are these creatures outside the cage and they come looking at him. And one of them comes over to him and he says, "You shouldn't be doing this. This is the wrong way to do it. Please do not do it this way." So then he comes to again. And then about 2 weeks later, he does the second session and he's back in the same place. And guess what happens? The entity comes over and says, "I told you last time you should not be doing this way." He said they were waiting for me. They were waiting for me.
So funny.
They knew I was coming.
It's so funny. Just to throw out there, guys, if you go back to episode 64, you'll actually hear me interview Mitch Schultz, who directed the documentary DMT, the Spirit Molecule, all on Dr. Rick Strassman's research and book.
Mitch wrote the foreword for my book, The Infinite Minefield.
How perfect. Yeah, he was great. And then I also did a episode more recently, 682, with Tricia Eastman, which right after I had done a 5-MeO DMT experience with her. And that was quite something. And I talk all about that in that episode.
That's a different level again, isn't it? I have friends that have had 5-MeO. Have you read the work of Martin Ball?
I have not.
Oh, you need to check him out. He lives not far from you, relatively, in States Journey. He's up in Oregon, I think. Dr. Martin Ball, and he's written a series of books on 5-MeO DMT. One of it's called the Untheological Paradigm. I mean, I did an event in London every 2 years. There's an event called Breaking Convention, which takes place at the University of Greenwich. I was a speaker 4 years ago, and so was Martin. But we knew each other before that, because I'm fascinated by his entheological paradigm, which is the idea that we are all one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, as Bill Hicks said. But again, me, he does the science of it. What is the evidence for this? That, it's a singular consciousness, and we are just kind of waves of an ocean of consciousness, which again is where my ideas are coming from as well, which is good.
Yeah, it is. It's an amazing thing that's unfolding. This sort of ripple awakening, sort of like the 100th monkey, right?
Yeah.
People are really taking it seriously now. People who not so long ago would have laughed you out of the joint now, or I can see people even in my own life, like my parents or my mother at least, or who had such narrow focus on what reality was, and organized religion sort of perspectives, and sort of that the cracks that are that are opening for people. It's just fascinating to observe and watch that ripple take place.
Well, I think this is it. The evidence. People who are in denial, they cannot. The thing is with my critics, and there's not that many of them, to be honest. It is quite reasonable in terms of that. In fact, my biggest critics are the believers. My biggest critics are the people who feel that my research is compromising their belief in life after death and everything else. Whereas it's not. I'm on their side. But all I'm saying is that if we are to take this to the masses, if we are to take this to the people, we have to do the science. Otherwise, we're dead in the water. We can't turn around and say a dead person told me this, because you're going to be laughed out of court. You've got to do the science. So what I do is I make sure when I engage with people, when I engage with skeptics hate me. Skeptics absolutely hate me. For that reason, if I can go as deep into quantum physics, as deep into neurology and neurochemistry as they like, I can go probably deeper than most of them. And my arguments are fairly powerful. And because it's science, I can say, that research done by particular individuals, are just powerful. And that's what we do. The evidence is there. The evidence is being ignored because they're paradigm changing. And people are clinging on to the present materialist reductionist paradigm genuinely because it's so effective. It works. It can explain so many things, but it can't explain dark matter. It can't explain dark energy. It can't explain consciousness, as David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher, said many years ago. The hard problem of consciousness. How does inanimate matter in my brain create me? It's we're not there. We think we are. We're suffering from hubris. In exactly the same hubris that the physicists were in the late 1890s, where they were turning around and saying, there's only one real problem at the moment. It's that pesky old ultraviolet catastrophe. We're not quite sure about that. And it was the ultraviolet catastrophe that Max Planck in December 1900, in a presentation in Berlin, changed the world. And he discovered the quantum world. And that matter and energy are quantized. They'd never thought about that before. It had never dawned on them. And then in 1905, Einstein comes up in his magical year of his 3 papers. The world changed. And suddenly we saw the world in a completely other way. But most people are still stuck in 1897. Right. Their science is still 1897.
All right. Well, now seems like a good moment to take a quick minute to tell those of you who aren't familiar a bit about our sponsor, Gaia. I've been a big fan of Gaia for many years now, which is why they're the only content provider I've ever reached out to in regards to potentially supporting this podcast. So needless to say, I'm very excited they're now supporting the show. Gaia truly is my personal go-to source for streaming consciousness content on the web. They have an incredible 7,000 plus exclusive videos covering 5,000 years of wisdom. Just to give you an example, on the show Missing Links, the incredible researcher Greg Braden explores all the biggest questions concerning who we are, where we come from, where we're going, by connecting the missing links between science and spirituality to complete our understanding of humanity's history and to better understand the interconnectedness of all things. Awesome, right? And that's just one example. As you guys constantly hear me say, it's a daily conscious effort to maintain an elevated vibration. And if you're looking to go deep down the rabbit hole to do so, then Gaia is the best place I know of to do it, period. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. Check it out. Yeah. Yeah. You know, what you were talking about, the whole sort of explanation of how we sort of go back and repeat and, you know, as the Daemon sort of thing. I mean, then, of course, you get into this idea and you talked about the Daemon, like reaching a point it hadn't reached before. But, you know, would you then go a step further and look at the fractal nature of reality and say, okay, well, there's a super Daemon and then there's a super Daemon, and then it just keeps, you know, expanding. What is your thoughts on that?
I would argue that probably it's again interesting, and you're very perceptive there in your point. And I'd refer back to the writings of a guy called John William Dunn, who was an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer. And he wrote a series of books in the late 1920s, early 1930s on time. And he was quite fascinated by short-term precognitions and why people have them, why they have dream precognitions. And he argued that there's a version of us that exists in another time. It's quite a simple argument, but it's quite a deeply thinking one. It's the idea that how do we know time flows? If I know a river is flowing, the reason I know a river is flowing and is moving because I can see the riverbanks. That's what gives me the idea of flow. But if there were no riverbanks and you're just in a river flowing, you have no sensation of movement. So
you have no perspective.
No perspective.
Or contrast.
You need
Context.
something to measure against. And what he argued was that there is a second time, time 2, that time 1 moves against. And there must be an observer, you, in time 2 to observe this. And then there must be a time 3, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where you get the infinite regress that you were talking about. But I'd like to believe it stops with the Daemon and the Adeline. And the reason being, there might be, I would then argue, there probably is a super Daemon, an ultra Daemon, which is the collective unconscious, Jung's collective unconscious. Okay. So that is, the Daemon is an emanation of the collective unconscious that is embodied in some way. Now, again, going back, this is nothing new. This goes back for thousands of years.
Like the God and, you know, the father and son kind of.
Oh yeah,
idea.
It's going back to Gnosticism. In fact, the terms Daemon and Adeline are actually Gnostic terms that I use. They're quite specific. I didn't just pick them out the air. They are quite specific terms. So if you read up what a daemon is, Daemon, it's quite specific, as is an Eidolon. Eidolon is the same word as idol. You know, it has a very specific meaning. And what the Gnostics believed, and what the other versions of Gnosticism, from Sufism to the Kabbalah, they all consider that there is a shard of what's called a pleroma, the fullness, the reality behind this reality inside us all. And that's what I call the Daemon. The everything that there is in Kabbalistic terms is called the Or Ein Sof. It's the everything that there is. And it's the same in Sufism, and it's the same in Gnosticism. And again, all these three groups all say that this reality is a simulation. They don't use the word simulation. they say it's been created by the demiurge. It's been created by a false maker. But it's a way of explaining it in old-fashioned terms, the idea it's a simulation. Now, from there, you can then move on to the Eastern religions. The idea in Hinduism, for instance, they have the concept of Brahman. And Brahman is everything that there is. And inside you, again, is Atman. And Atman is part of you that's part of the greater something. It goes time and time again. And again, you're in Orange County. You're just round the corner from one of my favorite writers, Philip, where he was born, where he lived, Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick used exactly these arguments. Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the regular co-hosts of the show, Christopher Jackson, one of my best friends, his uncle actually has, I guess, owns the rights to a few of Philip K. Dick's stories, and one of them was even made into a movie, or he put not a very good one, but his uncle's partner thought he could write and direct it himself. But so I was just having a conversation about Philip K. Dick last week with him. He was talking all about Valis and the idea of making that into a movie, and that whole thing. So I'm curious to learn more about it from you.
Yeah, Valis would be a most amazing movie, because Valis, again, is the idea. It is to do with what Phil claimed took place in what he called 2374, which was in March 1974, where he had a series of extraordinary experiences that he believed that this reality is overlain, is an overlay of a deeper reality, and time stopped in 33 and in 89 or 90 AD with the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, and that we've been caught in a time warp. And he also argued that there are different forms of time. He wrote this an incredible thing called the exegesis, which was all these ideas and all these hand notes and everything. Because as you're probably aware, I wrote a book called The Man Who Remembered the Future, about Philip K. Dick.
Oh, about Philip K. Dick. Right.
And I argue that Philip K. Dick is a classic example of my hypothesis. I mean, he did most of the things that my hypothesis suggests, and I know people like Phil's wife, Tessa, and various other individuals who are in Phil's life. And, I know, for instance, he predicted his own death. He actually saw his own death circumstances in a dream. To the letter, he had a dream whereby, and I have a copy of the letter, which he wrote at about 1975, 76, to a pen pal, Gloria, I can't remember her surname now. But anyway, in it, he says that, and it says in the letter, I think I'm becoming precognitive. Last night in a series of hypnagogic images, I saw deep undersea oceans, and then one clear, sharp image, a man lying stomach down between a settee and a coffee table. I think I see the future. A few years later, his friends were calling round to see him. Couldn't get into the house. He didn't turn up. They used to every Tuesday night get together and have a get together. They couldn't get in. And I've interviewed the person who knocked on the door, so I know this for a fact. They knocked on the door. They opened the door, and Phil was found lying on his stomach between a settee and a coffee table. He saw his own death circumstances. And the important thing here is Phil was not dead. He'd had a stroke. He didn't die until the Saturday. So his daemon knew his death circumstances, and his daemon was putting it into his mind to say, Phil, be careful, because this is going to happen to you. That's fact. Right. That it's unarguable. I have the letter.
Right. Wow. So is talking a little bit more, if you would, about the, because I have not read any of his books. I have seen a few of the short stories that I believe Amazon has done, taken some of his work and
they had the man in the high castle. Which they made a series of. And of course, there's been a whole series of movies, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, what else, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was Blade Runner. So, although you may not think although you may not think you know him, and his writings, you do. And of course, he was hugely influential on The Matrix. You know,
right. And so, you know, when in your book, I mean, do you sort of suggest that a lot of these stories are based off of his precognitive abilities, seeing alternate timelines or futures, or you know, what exactly do you go over?
The reason I say the man who saw who remembered the future is that there were a whole series of strange events that took place in his life. Again, Phil was a fiction writer. Phil would embroider, as Tessa has said. Phil embroidered things. It's what he did. But you've got to take at face value the things he said, because we've got no way of proving otherwise. But one of the things he said, for instance, was that he would find in his own future that he would suddenly find himself in a set of circumstances he'd written about 20 years before in a story. I mean, there's one example in one of his stories whereby he's at an all-night petrol station. And while he's at Phil finds himself at an all-night petrol station. And a black man comes over to him and asks for help. And Phil initially doesn't help and then decides he will help him. And as this is happening, Phil remembers that one of his books he wrote in the 1960s has exactly the incident taking place. And he suddenly thinks, my God, I'd written this 20 years ago. So I must have remembered it from my own future. And I embroidered it into a story. Now, I know writers, this happens to writers a lot. In my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Extraordinary Secret Self, I give 6 or 7 examples of famous writers who discover themselves living a plot line of an earlier book they've written. And this is because the daemon remembers. And when you're in writing mode, you create, writers know this, you create ideas seem to download from nowhere. And you write about them because they're just appearing in your mind. And these are future memories. You use future memories that you haven't experienced yet, and you put them in your novels and your stories. There might be things that you might not experience in this life, but you either experience them in another, or you'll experience them in a future life. And this is what happened to Phil all the time. He continually did this. He had a concept called orthogonal time, which is very similar to what J.W. Dunn did. He doesn't know about J.W. Dunn, but nevertheless, J.W. Dunn had the same idea. The idea that there's a time that runs at a right angle to every second now. So every second we live, there's a right angle time running off it. And in fact, real time, there is no time. There's a guy called Julian Barber, who's an English mathematician, wrote a book a few years ago called The End of Time, where you can prove mathematically that time cannot exist in the way it does. If time is quantized like everything else, there is a minute, then there's another minute, or a second and another second, but they don't touch. They're a kind of like subatomic particles. There's no communication between them. It's consciousness that gives the idea of time and space, because time and space are the same things. And it's our minds that give us this impression of depth and distance. Do you know the movie Interstellar? Yes. Okay, do you know the Tesseract sequence in that? It's when he pushes through the bookcase.
Yep.
And he sees the life of his daughter. And Christopher Nolan, the director, wanted to get across this idea of orthogonal time. And people have asked me, or people have been questioning for years, what was he doing there? Well, what he was doing was he was giving you the idea of multiple timelines.
Yep.
And how you can look from the 5th dimension, that is the dimension outside of space and time. And you will see reality from outside. You will see it as a continuum, not as single moments, but as a whole lifetime. And this is what Phil argued. And in Valis, these are some of the central sequences of Valis. And his other book, Ubik. You know, Ubik, there are people existing in what he calls half-life. These people are existing exactly what my cheating the ferryman suggests. It's uncanny. He was writing my cheating the ferryman hypothesis in, 1967? A very similar idea. The difference is I do the science. Phil did the fiction. I do the science of it. He was so accurate. He was so right. And what's this? And get this. This is the freakiest thing. If you've not heard this before, people have told me that Philip K. Dick predicted me. Really? Seriously. Oh. This is freaky. Wow. This is so freaky.
That's so cool.
Philip K. Dick, I was told this by a group of Philip K. Dick fans when I did a lecture a few years ago. They were interesting coincidences and synchronicities, and all these synchronicities happened. And then they came down and they spoke to me. And the reason they spoke to me was they said, did you know Philip K. Dick predicted you? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. This was before I wrote the book on Philip K. Dick. It's what stimulated me to write about him. And they said, do you know that in a novel he wrote called Martian Time Slip, he has a character called Anarch Peake. And Anarch Peake has these wonderful theories about time and everything else. Okay,
so just so you guys remember, we're listening to Anthony Peake here. All right, go on.
You're listening to Anthony Peake. Now, imagine a scenario that in some form of alternate universe or in some form of worldview, Phil didn't die in 1981 and managed to survive and live to see my book, The Daemon, come out. Imagine that he then sees that in a dream sequence. He'll see a kind of a book cover appearing in front of him. And he did have these dreams. He had dreams where he saw books in front of him.
Right.
Imagine he sees the book fleetingly and he sees the title. And the writer is somebody called A something Peake. And then subliminally, he then decides to write a book about this whole way in which the time is going backwards. And the character is Anarch Peake. Now, do I believe that? No, I think it's a coincidence, but it's still weird.
Do you? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's stretching it a little bit because he doesn't spell it with an E on the end. But then again, why would you get the name absolutely right? But it is odd.
Right.
It is odd. It is odd.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the most common last name.
No, it's not.
It's
absolutely not. So, why would he even think about that? But an anarch is a religious leader because the Anarch Peake character was a religious leader and a cult leader. And some people have accused me of being a cult leader. My wife does that all the time. I'm not, but
I've received a guide to cult leadership book for a birthday present once upon a time. So I've had a few jokes.
You need to advise me then. That would be good.
We should get our cults together and we can form a super cult.
Wow, wouldn't that be good? Yeah, we need to come up with a name for it. But yeah, let's do it. Make a lot of money.
Let's work on that, yeah.
Make a lot of money. I mean, as people have said to me, if I turn around one day and said, you know what, I'm fed up doing all this science and trying to support my stuff, I'll just say I'm channeling it from the planet Tharg. I'll say that some entity is talking through me. I'd make millions. Yep. I'd make millions. And I wouldn't need to prove anything. And the people would buy the books by the droves. But that's how people are. That's how people are.
Yeah, well, I like the path that you've chosen, Anthony. This is pretty epic to pick your brain. And, I originally was connected with you via a listener of the show, Ben, who reached out and said, oh my gosh, Brandon, I know you love synchronicity stories. You got to go check out, I believe it was on the Ascend podcast, where you were telling, and I don't even know if you remember or not, but he said you recounted a number of incredible synchronicities and stories that I'd love to hear. So, of course, as soon as I looked into your work at all, I'm like, yes, I want to hear more than that. I want to bring him on. So, it's something that I always go to, stories of synchronicity or serendipity, positive paranormal stories. I'd love to hear what you got.
Well, we've got myself and my groups. I'm very into neologism, new words to describe things, and I call it synchronidipity.
I like that.
It's the
synchrodestiny I've heard before too.
Synchrodestiny, yeah. And in fact, I contributed a chapter. There's a wonderful book on Synchronicity Book 2, which I contributed a chapter to, where I did the physics. I think the chapter I discussed about Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, Pauli exclusion principle, together with Jung and the way in which they work together. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, that Wolfgang Pauli was fascinated by synchronicities. But synchronicities in my life have just been beyond any understanding. I mean, I'll give you an example. The one that really there's two that send shivers up my spine. The first one is when I was researching my first book, Is There Life After Death, way before I got the publishing contract and anything. I was going off on various tangents in terms of my ideas where the book was going. And I was particularly interested in mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are organelles inside the cell of every body, every cell in your body. And they are unusual in the sense that they actually have their own DNA. Their DNA is different to the standard DNA that's found in the rest of the body. And this DNA is carried through the female line. Okay. Now, I'm reading about this and I'm joining dots, which now even more in my new book that I'm writing now, I'm going to be really blowing the lid off DNA and various other things. My new book, which I'm halfway through at the moment. But anyway, going back. So DNA. So I thought to myself, whereabouts in my bookcase will I have any books on DNA? Now, a little bit of background information. I never dog-ear book pages. I have this thing about books. I don't break the spine and I will not dog-ear a page. I like my books to be pristine and I own thousands of books. Okay. So I go to the bookcase and I think Richard Dawkins, he's a microbiologist. I have all of his books. He must have written about it at some stage. And I picked up his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Okay. As I opened the book, I thought, when did I last read this? And I suddenly had a flashback to being on a beach in Greece, a little island called Simi. And I suddenly remembered reading the book and going up to get a drink. It was like one of these flash memories that suddenly a memory just came to me when I touched the book. It was as if the memory came out the book. I picked the book up and I noticed that one page had been dog-eared by my earlier self 15 years or so before. I knew with absolute certitude what was going to be on that page. Wow. I opened it up. There it was, the reference to mitochondria. Now, I then checked all of Richard Dawkins' other books, and at that time, that was the only book and the only page he referenced mitochondria. My earlier self, with its daemon influencing it, had said, I'm going to leave you a clue that you're on the right track. I'm going to show you that I know what you're going to do. So it had me do that. And it was a joke. I just could hear my daemon. You never would
normally do that, right? You would normally never dog ear.
Got you. But then the other one, which is even freakier, and I'd love statisticians. I mean, I did stats at postgraduate level, so I understand statistics. So when people start talking about statistics, you know, how long's a piece of string? But get this one. I was, for my first book, I was researching the work of a guy called J.B. Priestley. I wasn't to know that I was about to write a book on J.B. Priestley, which I finished 2 years ago. At that time, I didn't even know I was going to do this. It's really weird how these people come into my life because Priestley was a fascinating British playwright, really, really interesting guy. So he wrote a book called Man and Time, which I needed a copy of to do my research. I didn't have my own copy at the time. So what I did was I was living in a place called Horsham in the southeast of England. Took myself down to Horsham Library and asked Horsham Library, do you have any copies of Man and Time, which was published in 1964? Okay. They said, no, we don't. And none of the libraries here. You're going to have to order it from the British Library in Boston Spa in Yorkshire. So I had to fill in a form and have to pay a couple of pounds and the thing goes off. About 3 weeks later, quite on random, I get a message from the library to say, your book has arrived. You've got it for 2 weeks. When you get a chance, come into the library and pick the book up. So a couple of days later, I've got a few free moments. So I decide to go into the library, pick the book up and come back home. I then place the book in my study, forget about it for a few days. I'm going to bed one evening and I'm in the position that I've got to be reading all the time. I've got to be reading. I can't just not read. I'll read the back of a cereal packet if need be, if there's no book. It's just, I'm like that. Right. And I'm just an information junkie. I just soak it all in and it seems to stay in my head for some weird reason. I think I know why that is as well. I can explain that later. But anyway, So I then pick up the book and I go to bed and I'm sitting in bed and my wife's sitting next to me and she's reading away. And I just flick through the pages at random and I'm flicking through. Now the book's got about 300 pages, something like that. And I stop at one page and I start reading it. And Priestley's trying to explain time relativity and how it is that when you look at a star, you're seeing not as it's now, but because light travels at 186,000 miles a second, it takes time to get from here. So you're seeing the star as it was historically. And he said, but I don't explain this very well. So he then has a word box. And inside the word box, he's quoting a book by a guy called Coleman that was published in 1957. And Coleman turns round and says, imagine on the night of the 17th of March, 2000, there is an explosion on the star Betelgeuse. I turn round to my wife on the evening of, and I turn around to my wife and I say, "What year is it?" And she goes, "It's 2000. "What month is it?" "It's March." And then she's looking at me as she has this look. And she said, "It's March. You know it's March." And I said, "Yeah, and what day is it?" She said, "It's the 17th. And I said, "What time of day is it?" She said, "It's the evening." And I said, you're a mathematician. I could have picked up this book at any time. I picked it up. I brought it to bed on the very evening of the very day that Coleman said that this would happen.
Wow.
And she turned around and she said, "Oh my God, this is ridiculous." And I said, "Look, the evidence is there." So 3 days later, we're visiting my brother-in-law in Cheltenham, and we're in a second-hand bookshop, and books are piled everywhere. There's no rhyme nor reason to it. And Penny turns around, she goes, "I'm fed up of all this bloody synchronicity rubbish you talk about." She said, "What kind of book do you want? What book do you need now? What's your book wizard going to get?" And I said, I need a biography of William Blake." And she went, "Oh, for Christ's sake." It was right in her eye line. And she picked it up and she threw it across the bookshop and stormed out. And I'm just standing there going, what the hell is happening here? And it continues.
We're so close, and I want to hear it continue. I just looked down at it's March 27th as we record. So I'm like, oh, we're 10 days off.
It's freaky. It's freakier than that because, and I only discovered this, and this is the first interview I've mentioned this. My new book on J.B. Priestley, I focus in on a particular interview he did on British television in 1962 on a TV program called Monitor. Now, through the ministrations of his son, Tom, by the way, Tom Priestley, if you know the movie Deliverance. Do you know the movie Deliverance?
Uh-huh.
Have you ever seen it? Yeah. Do you know the dueling banjos sequence?
It's been so long ago that I saw that. I don't quite remember.
It's this kind of weird kid playing a banjo. And then these guys that are going to go down this river before they flood the valley, and they all come across a load of inbreds and it gets all horrible. But that sequence, Tom Priestley was responsible for that, and he won an Oscar for the soundtrack or the sound for that movie. So Tom's quite famous in his own right. But anyway, through Tom's ministrations, I was given access to a load of J.B. Priestley's letters at the University of Cambridge Library. I was the first person to read them all, which I discuss in my new book. But the interesting thing is, the reason the letters ended up was that Priestley was on a TV program, as I say, in 1962 or 63, I think it was 63, called Monitor, a guy called Hugh Weldon. It was only comparatively recently I spotted the fact that it was the 17th of March. And I went, no. It's like the kind of the sound of the Twilight Zone comes out, or the Outer Limits. Just freaky.
Incredible. It's funny because as you refer to the daemon, and I always think of it sort of as my higher self, right? And I always say, yeah, of course I know myself well enough to know what my higher self is like to some pretty significant degree. And I would certainly leave myself all these Easter eggs. And, on this show, we talk about synchronicity all the time because I have I do 5 episodes a week. So it will unfold in real time and it will connect to the listeners and in ways and layers to the onion that are just like, you can't make this stuff up, and it really is. But when you really think about it, it's like, yeah, okay, well, what would my daemon do? Well, yeah, it would take such delight in planting these Easter eggs and playing with time and space in this way where, reflections from something, decades ago, it comes up at the exact right moment now to tie the two time periods together and sort of that wink, right? That I'm here, I'm watching you and I'm playing with you, right?
WWMDD. Yeah. We'll call it that. What would my daemon do? We should have some T-shirts out.
I love it. That's a great idea. That comes, if you join the cult, you get one of those T-shirts, right?
Absolutely. We're working on the cult now. We're cooking on gas in terms of the cult, and because I studied cults at university, we can really do this. We can really do it.
I love it. It's so funny. Oh man. So, One of the things a couple things as we sort of wind down here. One, I want to bring up to you, I've recently revisited a book from, I originally read it a decade plus ago, and I revisited it recently, and I really find it fascinating and curious what your thoughts are on it. Journey of Souls. And I imagine you're familiar.
I know the name, but that's about it.
In Destiny of Souls as well. And, I'm forgetting the author's name now, but, hypnotherapist who actually documented very scientifically, talking to people in a, hypnotized state, and would take them back, regress them to, past lives. And then after they passed, he would then, proceed to say, okay, now what? It was like lives between lives. And it's fascinating because he basically over, decades of doing these sorts of, studies with people and experiments with people, came up with this whole blueprint of what things are sort of like on the other side, and how it, we're energetic beings that resonate at different color frequencies based off of how we've leveled up through the game of physicality. And, these soul groups that we sort of, reminiscent of Eben Alexander's findings, that we are indeed part of these soul groups that continue to reincarnate with one another, and, how those relationships play out. And it very, very fascinating. So I had assumed you might have read it, but if not, you might add this to your...
I've tended to avoid books like that because I tend to find they irritate the hell out of me.
Really?
When they claim they've got science, you start looking at the science and you find the science falls apart. I'm not saying that this book does. It's just that it's happened to me on many occasions when I tend to judge sometimes a book by the cover. And if they make sensational claims, that tends to be a problem to me. In that I've been disappointed so many times when what I've done is I've read a book and I've said, right, okay, let's go back to the source documents. Let's see what the actual original academic papers said. And you find that the academic papers didn't say that. And you find that this kind of Chinese whispers and people copied from other people. But I know, is it Michael Weiss or something like that? The name rings a bell, but it's something I need to read.
Yeah, Michael Newton. He was, Michael Newton, PhD. Yeah. Very. I really liked his approach. It was, and of course he wasn't referencing other studies or anything other than his own accounts of putting people in a hypnotic state.
What you'll find is a lot of these writers work in isolation. It's one of the major problems we have within this field is that everybody has their own little bee in their bonnet. And they stay and they stick with it and they don't share it and they don't cross-reference. Whereas there's a group of writers I work with now that we're working together. We haven't got the answers. Far from it. We're just like everybody else. We're wandering around in the dark looking for a black cat that isn't there. But effectively,
Schrodinger's cat is the wrong universe, wrong timeline.
So, like the guy I mentioned earlier on, we want to work together on this because we want to get a really accurate picture. And I tend to try and avoid subjective when people have subjective experiences. It's not because I don't believe them. It is just that I can't.
Doesn't help
prove
the
it.
end. It doesn't help what your aim is to.
But I'd agree. I think
proof.
The idea of vibrationally levels and things. There is certain evidence for that. I think that clearly the idea of a singular consciousness or a consciousness field that people can attune into, that makes rational sense to me as well. The idea of past lives, I have certain issues with because I think what people are doing is they're tuning into the collective unconscious here. They're tuning into the Akashic field, and whatever they tune into is what they link onto. There are certain logical issues I have with these models. And funnily enough, if you're interested, I wrote a very short paper last year outlining in Priestley my overall hypothesis, which I posted again today on my Facebook wall. So if anybody's interested, it's also on my website, about where I put forward and I say, okay, these are the options. Is there life after death? If there is life after death, what do we get? Is it just we die and that's the end of us? Do we appear in heaven and we live forever and a day in eternity? Do we reincarnate? And if we do reincarnate, what's the process? Or my model that we exist within a simulation and consciousness is unitary and we are embodied bits of consciousness existing within this simulation. And I put forward the arguments for all of them. And I have to say that the only one that makes logical sense to me is my own idea. But then, of course, it wouldn't it?
Right.
But that's the only one that makes logical sense to me. The other ones don't. Like reincarnation makes no sense to me. In that,
interesting.
If I'm growing and developing, what's the point of not being able to remember my past lives? Surely I should remember them to learn by my mistakes. And what's the point of being reborn as a totally different person in a totally different place without even knowing who you are? It's like playing a computer game where you start the computer game and when you load it up again, it's a completely different computer game. Because that's the fact of the matter, isn't it?
Now, what if there's some subconscious, it's sort of that underlying information? For example, a lot of this sort of idea about the ultimate nature of reality and so forth, as I was exposed to it when I first started exploring, consciousness and the idea, the inherent oneness of all things. And it seems so familiar to me and resonated so much. I mean, you have people who have gifts who, they're inexplicable gifts of, the kid who can play like Mozart at 4 years old, or these remembrances of. I hear what you're saying. It's like if you're tapping into the Akashic, and you're remembering someone else's life. And I think to some degree, my own philosophy and perspective on this, there's some truth to that. When but also when you take, I don't know if you're familiar with the short story "The Egg" by Andy Weir. I resonate closely with that idea. I would recommend checking it out. There's even a great adaptation of it on YouTube. It's about 10 minutes or so. And basically it's showing, this guy, he dies, he goes and talks to God afterwards, and God's like, yep, okay, now you basically play out every role that ever exists, and then you get to be born. That's like the beginning of your next stage. And to me, that idea really resonates. It's like if it's all one consciousness, then it's all me with degrees of separation. I'm literally talking to an extension of self right now. So it's just a matter of...
this is exactly the argument I come out with as well, to say that there's an argument to say, God is everybody. Now, if you're God, for whatever it is, and you are an eternal being, what would you do? You'd be bored out your skull if you had a skull. Yep. But of course, God doesn't have a skull. But you'd be bored. So what would you do? You create your own soap opera.
That's right.
And then you'd live in the soap opera and forget who you are. And again, Philip K. Dick talks about this. It's a term called anamnesis. It's from the Platonic. It's from the ancient Greek mystery schools. It's the remembering of forgetting. And you remember what you were, but to be in here, you have to forget what you really are, and then you live the life through because you don't know who you are. And again, Philip K. Dick wrote a story about this back in the 60s, about a young child who in fact is God, but he's forgotten he's God. And it's a brilliant idea. And it makes, again, I'm totally with you on this. It makes so much sense. And it does explain savant syndrome. One of my previous books, The Infinite Minefield. Is it The Infinite Minefield? No, it's Opening the Doors of Perception, my last technical book. I have a whole section on savant syndrome. I discuss the work of Darrell Trefford and Bernard Rimland and Norman Geschwin and various other people in terms of how these children can do these things. There are children that are being experimented on at the moment who seem to be totally telepathic. There's one of the researchers in America at the moment is doing exactly this, Diane Hennessy Powell. And she's doing some fascinating work in terms of another future guest for you. Her work is just absolutely mind-blowing.
What's the name?
Diane Hennessy Powell. Again, if you go onto my website and go onto my interview, the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, scroll through, you'll find her. You'll find her on there. She's doing some great work. So she has a little girl called Haley, and the thing she's working on something called the Telepathy Project. Uncanny. We haven't got time to go into it now, but if you interview her, she'll tell you far better than I can. But the thing she's got is just incredible.
Wow. Thank you for that suggestion. I will definitely check that out. And as we sort of wind down here, one of the things that you had mentioned that I was really curious to hear you talk about, prior to us turning on and recording, you had mentioned something about a lucid light device. What is that?
Whoa. Music again. How long have we got?
We could go another 10 minutes or so.
Okay, fine. I'll give you some background information. I was invited out to Switzerland.
Let me change that. If it's going to make a radical difference in what you share, we can go longer. So,
Okay, I'll just give a bit of background information what the Lucia is, and then we'll go into the event we're doing. I was invited over to Switzerland around about 8 or 9 years ago by a lady called Evelina Lassa-Vallerano, who's a near-death researcher in Geneva. And she said that when you come over, because I was invited to speak at a place called Crête Barrande in the Alps, and she said that my friend, who's an Austrian guy, really loves your work. He's read your book, and because he had a near-death experience when he was a child, he believes that your ideas are the most revolutionary he's ever come across and explain his experiences to the letter. And he wants to come over from Austria with an associate of his because they've invented some device and they want you to test it out. So I said, okay, fine. Went over, and on the Saturday afternoon, Dr. Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Dirk Prokol turned up, wheeling in this device called the Lucia, the hypnagogic light experience. Now, Engelbert Winkler is one of the top consultant psychologists in Austria, and likewise, Dirk Prokol is one of the top neurologists in Austria. So these guys are seriously qualified guys. And they'd invented this machine initially because they wanted to create natural light in enclosed environments when they were working with troubled children, because they found they could hypnotize young children far better in natural light than they could elsewhere. So they had this machine initially, but then they introduced stroboscopic light to it, and they found that they could actually put people into altered states of consciousness. And they could reproduce feelings of out-of-the-body experiences, people seeing lights, seeing colors, seeing shapes. And they wanted me to test it.
Wow.
So they wheeled it in. By the way, if anybody's interested, if you go on YouTube and you just put Anthony Peake, Hypnagogic Lucia light device, you'll find the video they made of me testing it the first time. So I sit down, the machine comes on, and it's just white light, and nothing happens for about 5 minutes. And I'm thinking, oh, God, this is going to be so embarrassing. I'm going to have to make something up. And then suddenly the world exploded. It exploded. There was a blue light came over from one visual field, red light from another. They started swirling like a tunnel effect. I felt I was being pulled into a tunnel. I then felt I could feel vibrations in my body, which is what happens in the out-of-body experience. It was reproducing that. I also saw in my extreme periphery vision what seemed like a breakdown in my visual field. I was allowed to look at it, and I saw the only thing I can say is that I was hovering over the surface of a planet, thousands of miles up, and I could see the curvature of the planet. I could see blue lights flickering up and down the planet. And being the hero I am, I asked them to turn it off because I was so terrified. Chunk,
really?
And it went. But then immediately afterwards, I was feeling vibrations in my head. And I think it was my pineal gland. I think it was my third eye had been opened and I was having vibrations. Okay, roll forward a few years.
That's
I've now
incredible.
been working with these guys on and off for quite a few years. Now, we want to do an event. We've been wanting to do an event together for years, and we've done a few, but nothing like this. In the middle of the UK, at a place called Drakelo, is what's called a shadow factory. This was a place that was built in the Second World War, and it was only declassified about 5 or 6 years ago. It's a tunnel complex. There are 5 miles of tunnels that run through this hillside. It was used in the Second World War to actually build airplanes like the wings of Spitfires. It was ultra secret. About 6,000 people worked down there, and nobody knew it was there.
Wow.
When the Second World War ended, it then became a nuclear bunker. And it was going to be a top secret nuclear bunker that Princess Anne and members of the royal family would come to if there was a nuclear war. Okay? It was declassified a few years ago, and it's been bought now by a local farmer. It is known to be phenomenally haunted. I mean, seriously haunted. There's poltergeist activity down there. I've spoken to people who have witnessed in-your-face poltergeist activity down there. It is the freakiest place. It is Dracolo Hill. Dracolo is Old Anglo-Saxon English for Dragon's Hill. Dragon in Old English doesn't mean a fire-breathing dragon as in Game of Thrones. It's a spirit. It's a spirit that protects the land. There's something in there. There's something happening. There's weird. Magic mushrooms grow all around it. So there's psilocybin in the earth.
Wow.
Okay. You go inside. There's even a hospital in there. There's miles of these things and it's pitch black. There's no natural light. It's pitch black in certain areas. They use it for filming zombie movies and things. It's that creepy. So what we're going to do on Saturday, the 27th of April this year, the Austrians are coming over and they're bringing 6 or 7 of their new devices. They've made the device smaller. We're also bringing virtual reality headsets, and there's something called Seventh Wave, which has been designed by some of the top virtual reality designers in the UK. The virtual reality experience will bring about, you will have a 3-dimensional out-of-the-body experience and near-death experience in virtual reality. You will then use the Lucia device, which will then stimulate, and I believe the Lucia device stimulates your brain to create dimethyltryptamine. Okay? It actually stimulates the synthesis of melatonin into dimethyltryptamine. So these people will have that. There will be ambient sounds around the place. We will be doing holotropic breathing, which also can bring about altered states of consciousness.
Right.
And then we're doing tests on people in terms of their abilities, in terms of precognition. We've got a team under the auspices of Dr. David Luke, who's coming from the University of Greenwich. We're going to be testing people for precognition powers. We're going to be doing a lot of the kind of testing that people like Dean Radin and people have been doing under these controlled conditions. Then I appear as the master of ceremonies, and I'm going to be dressed as a cowled figure, and I'm going to be the Lord of the Underworld. I'm going to be Hades, and we're going to take them through a walk through the caves in pitch dark. And then we're going to get them to a place and we're going to reproduce the Plato cave myth of the idea of reality as an illusion. And then a friend of mine, Sam Constantine, will appear and she's going to be Persephone. And if you know the ancient legend that Persephone spent 6 months of the year in the underground with Hades, and then in the summer she'd come out and the summer would start. And then she's going to explain, because she's a powerful lucid dreamer and out of the body experiencer, so she's going to explain her experiences. There are 16 tickets for this. It's going to be just unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Details are on my site. Details are on my website. Details are also on Facebook, and I'm posting this quite regularly. This will be an experience you will never, ever, ever forget.
How long of a period is this going to, how long is the event?
3.5 hours. We're doing 2 sessions, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. So it'll be 3.5 hours for each. And as I say, these caves these tunnels are just, I've seen nothing like them. Nothing on the planet like them. It's just
incredible. That sounds epic.
But the poltergeist activity down there is just weird. They've shown me photographs of something that manifested down there while I was there, and they showed me the place it had manifested. It's like a star being standing in a hallway, and it's completely. Yeah, it's a being. It's a human body, and you can see the shape. It's in pitch darkness, and you can see the shape of the body, and it's got an outline of a human figure, and the stars inside it. It's the only way I can explain it. Unfortunately, I can't use that on Facebook because it belongs to another group. But I'm hoping at some stage to speak to them to be able to show that, because I've never seen anything like it. Never seen anything like it. And they said it just manifested in front of them. It just appeared.
Wow.
Wow.
You know, I'm about to start, about to launch a new show called Optimistic, spelled MYSTIC, and it's going to be talk show, late night talk show style, consciousness elevating, these kind of conversations, video production. But my plan, my vision is, and in future, if there were such a thing, time frame is to do a optimistic odyssey where I go to places and actually take it on the road to some degree. So I foresee a future timeline where I come to visit you for your next iterations of these events. A year or two, a couple years down the road, it would be really, really epic. Yeah, that would be so cool.
And that's when we start the cult.
Yeah, and then the cult will officially kick off. The Star Bean will be there to inaugurate you.
Totally. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all working up to.
So one question I have for you: this device, this Lucia device, is what you call it? Lucia. Are these available for sale?
Oh, yeah.
Or
yeah,
they...
buy them. Yeah, there's an American agent. There's an agent in California. You can buy them.
Wow, really? Where do I find that?
I'll send you if you just do a search on hypnagogic light experience, you'll find it. So the hypnagogic light experience. But I'll send you a link. I'll put a link up on Facebook, but I'll send you a link so you've got
Please.
it. No, you can. I know the agent over there. I'm trying to think of her name. She's really, really great character. No, these things are seriously powerful. They're going to take the world by storm. Particularly, there's this new academic paper that's about to come out, which proves that they tested people using the Lucia, and they had people taking psilocybin, and the same areas of the brain lights up when you're on Lucia as if you're on psilocybin. It's powerful. It's the serious, real deal. I've tried other light machines. This is on a different planet to the other things. The other things you just get, you might see a little bit of mandalas and you might see a little bit of light changes. This thing is like. It's like 5-MeO DMT.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Definitely send me the link, because part of my of the Optimistic is bringing fans to the property where we're having like retreat experiences on a recurring basis, and then filming the show. So I would love to have something like this there at the Mystic Manor, as we're calling it, to give people the that sort of experience. So including myself, that sounds absolutely
I can facilitate that. They'll even probably the guys in California will probably pop down and visit you and bring one along.
Oh, I'd love that.
They'll be more than happy to do this. And I know the Austrians travel worldwide with it. So, they might even be interested in popping over, if they can find something else down there. They will do so. And they're both great guys, both very down to earth, great fun. That's why we're going to enjoy the Dracula tunnels, because afterwards we're going to be so high after doing this. So a few bottles of wine and we're going to go crazy. It's going to be good.
I love it. That sounds like such an epic event. And this has been such an epic conversation, Anthony. You are quite something. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I don't know what to call you, man.
I don't know what I am. No idea. Weirdo.
Antonius Peake. What was it? What did Philip K. Dick call you? What was your other
Peake.
your alter?
Anarch
Peake. Anarch Peake. So I do have one last question for you as we wind down here, and it is this: in 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Anarch Peake?
We are here to learn. We are here to explore everything we can explore in terms of our lives. We're to go down every avenue and explore every opportunity, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to learn. And at the end of a myriad of lives, as Danny Rubin, who was the writer of Groundhog Day, said to me in an interview, he expected Connors to have around about 5,000 lives in his initial idea. And what you do is you live every day of every month of every year of your life over and over again to become a bodhisattva, to become perfect. And you live this in this timeless place. And at the end of that, you move on to whatever is next. I think. I hope. Yeah.
It sounds pretty reminiscent of the egg, as I referenced earlier. And one last thing here too. Would you please give listeners the best way to connect, to follow your work? Yeah. I think you referenced your website, but you didn't say what it was.
Yeah, okay. The website is anthonypeake.com. That's Anthony with an H, and Peake, P-E-A-K-E, as in Mervyn. And it's anthonypeake.com. I'm also extremely active on Facebook. Cool. Literally, I'm up to my 5,000 limit on friends, but I have another nearly 5,000 followers on there. So we got nearly 10,000 people regularly contributing, making comments, putting up ideas and everything else. We're an international community. We call ourselves Itladians, which is, again, it's the title of my first book, is The Life After Death. And that's just become what we call ourselves. See, we're a cult.
When the P-heads, as we all refer to ourselves, there's about 10,000 of us on Facebook. Once the P-heads come together with the Atlanteans, who knows? I mean, it's going to be world takeover, right?
Jeez, God. That's terrifying. World Domination League. Justice League of America.
Exactly. Oh, Anthony, you're a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time to share. Yes, I look forward to crossing paths in 3D at some point. Until then, journey well, my friend.
And you as well. Okay, all the best. Take care.
Well, everyone, that concludes this week's interview episode. Before we sign off, I wanted to let you all know that we have finally created the Game with the Universe on our website, where you can choose the first number that comes to your mind, and it'll pull up that episode number of the podcast. I've been saying this is a great way to co-create synchronicity and magic with your higher self for quite some time by doing this manually. But now, if you go to positivehead.com/YO Universe, there is a super fun and simple interface to play this game with your higher self. I firmly believe just by setting the intention to play in this way, it opens up the door for magic, and it's a synchronistic way to hone in on nuggets of wisdom out of the huge catalog of episodes that are specifically appropriate for you at this time in your journey to becoming the next greatest and grandest version of yourself. And it also makes for a super fun way to engage and invite friends, family, people on social media to check out the podcast as well. So be sure to check out positivehead.com/YOUNIVERSE, and be sure to tell all your friends so they can play a game with the universe, which also helps the show to reach new people, which I greatly appreciate. And as a quick reminder, be sure to also check out positivehead.com/transformation if you're curious to learn more about Purium superfoods and why I take them every day. On this journey of becoming the next greatest and grandest version of ourselves that we have all embarked upon, I can't stress the importance of managing your physical vibration enough. And quite honestly, Purium has put together the simplest plan I've found to do so, and I'm sincerely excited to share it with all of you. Otherwise, as you continue on your fabulous journey in this 3D reality, be sure to remember this. As long as you ain't dead, you're already positive ahead. Journey well, everyone, and thank you for being.